Mortality webinar series. My name is Rupert Seidel, and I'm really happy to welcome you here on behalf of the International Tree Mortality Network, which is also an initiative of the IUFLOR Task Force on Tree Mortality. And today's seminar, the fifth installment in our seminar series, will be given by Lisa Hulsman, who I'll be introducing shortly. Before I do that, let me just very briefly say a word to the International Tree Mortality Network. We are a group of scientists who focus on understanding the trends and causes of tree death via a global international network of people. And our idea is really to bring together different disciplines. So from remote sensing to forest inventory, modeling, and ecophysiology to understand tree mortality. For more information on our network and on our activities, you can visit our network at treemortality.net. Now, for today's webinar, the webinar will take for roughly 45 minutes presentation, leaving us 15 minutes for questions and answer. You can ask your questions at all times during the seminar already using the Q&A function in Zoom. There is this particular button with the two bubbles down below in your Zoom panel, and you can paste questions in there, and we will in the background organize these questions and then summarize them and ask them to Lisa at the end of the talk. Usually the way this goes is that we have much more questions than we can answer in the available time. So we do already apologize if your question is not being asked to Lisa and is not being answered. But please do post your questions. We usually have a very lively discussion. Also, if there is technical difficulties or anything else, you can use the chat function to report those. And with these technical things out of the way, I'm very happy to introduce Dr. Lisa Hulsman as our speaker today. Lisa has received her PhD from ETH Zurich and has worked extensively on tree mortality modeling. She currently leads a junior research group at the University of Regensburg, and she combines empirical and simulation approaches to understand biotic interactions. I'm really happy to have Lisa here with us today because it's a first in three particular ways. So first, Lisa is our first speaker in the seminar series from Europe, which is great. So we're increasing our diversity in terms of space. Second, Lisa is the first speaker that focuses particularly on modeling. I mentioned before the different fields that we are trying to bring together in the Tree Mortality Network, and we had speakers focusing more on ecophysiology and remote sensing, and Lisa will particularly look at mortality from a modeling perspective today. And lastly, Lisa is the first early career scientist that we are having in our seminar series. So diversity is something that's very important for us at the Tree Mortality Network, and we've had very esteemed colleagues giving seminars previously, but we also want to give the stage to early career scientists, and Lisa is the first one to set us off here. So this is also something that I think is an important message here. And without further ado, Lisa will talk to us about tree mortality modeling, a tool for ecological inference and a challenge for projecting forest dynamics. Lisa, the floor is all yours. Looking forward to your contribution.
Okay, yeah, thanks a lot, Rupert, for the very nice introduction and for the possibility to speak in this seminar. It's a real pleasure today, to see so many people who really care about tree mortality. And yeah, for me, this is kind of a special situation. When I did my PhD, I knew only a few people who cared so much about this topic, and I felt that these people did exist, but there was actually little exchange between the different disciplines. So I really appreciate that the Tree Mortality Network provides actually this platform to bring all these scientists and also different perspectives together. Yeah, I think this is actually very essential to tackle the questions that still remain with respect to tree mortality and to advance the field, which is, and I think we can all agree on this, definitely not an easy task. On the other hand, I presume that you are here because you think tree mortality is an exciting and fascinating process and object of research. And yeah, I hope you also enjoy my perspective on tree mortality and find it inspiring for your own work. Yeah, as Rupert already said, I would like to invite you to join me in exploring tree mortality from the perspective of an empirical modeler. Yeah, not only from with a focus on projecting forest dynamics, but also having a look at what empirical tree mortality models can tell us about the mechanisms that are structuring forest ecosystems. So yeah, why does mortality play such a crucial role for our understanding and the prediction of forest ecosystems? Tree mortality really has a key position between the mechanism and the emergent patterns of forests, or saying it with the words of Franklin et al., tree death is a rich ecological process. So tree mortality really affects a number of forest properties that we may be interested in. So to name only a few, tree mortality affects productivity, carbon pools, diversity, species composition, but also the internal structure of forests, including microhabitats. And it creates important impacts on the dynamics, successional pathways, and also the stability of forests. And finally, mortality also influences the geographic distributions of individual tree species. Yeah, and on the other hand, we can then also imagine the mechanisms that influence tree mortality. So this is basically everything like competition, light, climate, soil, water, nutrients, but also species differ in their mortality, and species also varies over ontogeny. We also know that pathogens and herbivores play an important role for tree mortality. And of course, this can also be in a more abrupt scenario, so in terms of disturbances. The consequences of this dichotomy basically is that these mechanisms manifest themselves and also their impacts on the forest characteristics through tree mortality. So this means also that climatic and environmental changes can act via this pathway. So basically, mortality stands really in the middle of this pattern. But there's also another very useful attribute of mortality. It is part of many forest monitoring programs. So there is data on tree mortality. And maybe one limitation already to mention it now. Mortality is not the only vital rate of trees, but it acts jointly together with growth and reproduction. But it has a few advantages in comparison to these other demographic rates. So tree mortality creates an instantaneous change in a forest, and it is irreversible. On the other hand, population growth rates are also very highly sensitive to mortality. So this can be shown by population models. So thus investigating how tree mortality responds to these mechanisms can be very insightful to understand what is driving forest ecosystems and their properties. And this is exactly what empirical mortality models allow us. So basically, we are interested here in the effects of these mechanisms on tree mortality rates, or also tree mortality probabilities of individual trees. So to break this down into the essential components of empirical tree mortality models, basically they relate the probability of tree death to tree stand or site characteristics. And we take these relationships from different observations, different data sets. Or in a visual picture, you can imagine it like this. We take data and then we fit these statistical models. I guess most of you can imagine that we could do this with logistic regression, but there are also a bunch of other statistical frameworks that would work in these cases. And I don't want to go too much into these technical details today, but more to think about what can we take from these kind of models. So basically, I see two main applications of empirical tree mortality models. The first is ecological inference. So if we fit empirical mortality models, we can basically set them up so that we test predictions from ecological theories that we would like to prove. So we define a prediction that is derived from a certain theory, and then we can test this against observation. On the other hand, we can also use such empirical models to detect and quantify changes. For example, when we're interested in recent climatic and environmental changes, and we want to know whether mortality changes in response to these environmental variables. And on the other hand, empirical tree mortality models can also be useful for dynamic forest models, because they can help to constrain mortality predictions with suitable data sets. And then these dynamic forest models can be used to project future forest dynamics and also species distributions, for example. And yeah, maybe another, sometimes not often considered application of dynamic forest models, they can also help us to understand how these different demographic processes act together and what actually is important and what not. In my talk today, I would like to cover both applications of empirical tree mortality models. In the first part, I would like to focus on one example for ecological inference and introduce a hypothesis that very heavily relies on tree mortality. This is the Johnson-Connell hypothesis, a very debated ecological theory or hypothesis. And I will summarize a bit what current evidence looks like and explain why mortality is such an important prediction to test this hypothesis. And in the second part of the talk, I will discuss how empirical mortality models can advance dynamic projections of forest dynamics and which difficulties remain, especially in that field. So let's start with the Johnson-Connell hypothesis. What is that and how is that related to tree mortality? The idea has been proposed already 50 years ago, so this is actually something that is out there for quite some time, and it states that at high conspecific seedling density and close to conspecific adults, small trees suffer higher pathogen loads. So, and therefore the recruitment close to adults, here marked with these black crosses, is less successful than further away. And this can increase the probability that a tree is actually replaced by a different species and not by its own. This two mechanisms, so the distance and density component, jointly became known as conspecific negative density dependence, or CNDD. This is also the term I will use in the next slide because it's a bit shorter to say. CNDD received a lot of attention because it is thought to actively stabilize species abundances and then thus prevent species from becoming very dominant. So if this is the case, CNDD may contribute to coexistence and also to species diversity. So what we should see is that in forests with higher or stronger CNDD effects, there should be higher diversity. The drivers of specialized neighborhood interactions, such as these conspecific negative density dependence effects, could be different. So Johnson and Connell actually hypothesized that specialized enemies are responsible for these processes, but of course also abiotic niche effects or autotoxicity could create similar patterns. So evidence is not entirely clear on that, what could cause these effects in the effects that we observe. There is some evidence that indeed specialized enemies may be responsible for intraspecific resource competition and autotoxicity. It's a bit unclear So basically, the doubts are that the dimensional niche space that must be very high in dimension cannot be created by abiotic niches. And on the other hand, that autotoxicity, so really releasing a species-specific toxin, has a questionable adaptive value. So these are not considered that often, although it is a bit tricky to test this over many species. But I will not go too much into the details here, and basically take it more from a phenomenological approach. Just imagine that these are specific interactions between individuals of the same species, and we are interested in that if these interactions are negative. So how can we test that these effects are really acting on within a species or among individuals? One of the most important predictions for testing CNDD involves actually tree mortality. So here the idea is that performance varies as a function of seed or seedling density or with the distance to adults of the same species. And if CNDD was indeed existing for that species, we should find mortality that is highest at high conspecific densities and close to conspecific neighbors. And exactly that is what hundreds, I guess that's somehow the number, of studies have really tested. So this can be either done based on observational studies. So for example, on these forest inventory data sets that report individual trees over time. And then one can check whether, depending on the environment, we see this kind of effects. Something similar is also done on seedlings that are also tagged, so we can follow them over time. And unfortunately, there is no systematic meta-analysis on the evidence of these observational studies. I guess this is also related to the diversity of approaches that are used in this context. Many of these studies actually did find CNDD, not for all species and not at all sites, but it seems to be a mechanism that is common in forests. On the other hand, researchers also used seed and seedlings and actively manipulated conspecific distances and densities. And these experimental studies are more similar and were therefore summarized in meta-analysis. The first of this kind was a study by Kumita et al. And this study actually found negative effects between conspecifics. So you see here negative effects, which means that survival is reduced when trees are surrounded, seeds or seedlings are surrounded by more conspecifics or closer to conspecific adults. And actually in the study, overall, there was a consistently negative effect close to conspecific adults and at high conspecific seedling densities. A similar study, you can also imagine kind of an update, was carried out very recently by Song et al. And in this study, the effects were also controlled for taxonomic pseudo-replication. And again, there were some negative effects, significant negative effects of conspecifics. Here in this case, it was basically for seed density and for seedlings at close distances. So in summary, conspecific effects seem to be negative for many species and in many forests. So what we can take from this is that CNDD seems to exist. Okay, why do we care about this so much? And at this point, I would like to introduce now a second aspect of the Johnson-Connell hypothesis, which is actually that these effects are proposed to be stronger in the tropics. And if these effects were indeed stronger in the tropics, they could potentially contribute also to the latitudinal diversity gradient. So that we see several hundreds of tree species per hectare in the tropics, but only a few species in temperate and boreal forests. Yeah, so for this, CNDD must be stronger in the tropics. And basically, there is only one study so far that has tested this. And this study actually found a very strong latitudinal gradient in CNDD with stronger CNDD in the tropics. So what you see here is basically that here at low latitudes, this CNDD effects are more negative, and therefore we expect that here more stronger stabilization could happen. Nevertheless, there was a lot of criticism regarding the approach of these studies, and colleagues from Singapore found that this claim actually doesn't hold if an alternative corrected model was used. So then basically the patterns were gone. Yeah, you may wonder, why is that the case? What is going wrong here? To explain this, we have to revisit the predictions of tree mortality again. The predictions of CNDD again. So I have said already that one can do this with tree mortality, but there are alternatives. And one possibility is to look at transitions between life stages, for example, from seeds to seedlings, or from seedlings to recruits. And another approach is to take static data and look at recruits against adults. So how would we do this? This would look like that. So these approaches basically assume that the relationship between conspecific density and recruitment deviates from proportionality if CNDD is present. So the dashed line here is the assumption of proportionality, while the blue line would indicate that indeed there is CNDD. And if there are, yeah, so basically the idea is if there are less recruits than expected by proportionality at high adult densities or at high seedling densities, this is then interpreted as CNDD. The study that I just showed, the one with the latitudinal gradient, actually used this approach based on static data. So in this case, there is conspecific adults on the x-axis and the number of recruits in such quadrats on the y-axis. So why is this problematic? For this, we have to think about regression dilution, which is a common statistical problem, but in many cases, it doesn't really matter for us because we are not interested in proportionality, but we are basically assessing slopes, and if they differ from zero, then we are interested in it. But here it is different because we're interested if something differs from a certain line that we assume. And if there is an error in the x variable, and you see this is here increasing from the left to the right-hand side, the fitted line becomes actually flatter. So even though there is no CNDD, we would observe it. So it actually is something tricky because we would see CNDD only if there is a variation in our conspecific density that we cannot control for. So why should there be error in the conspecific densities? This is actually quite common because when we think about these quadrats where this error, where this adult densities come from, they basically discretized, while processes in nature often do not follow these kind of quadrats. And then we also know that there's dispersal going on. So there is exchange between these different quadrats. And yeah, maybe also to say something about this term recruitment, it's actually not regressing recruitment, actual recruits against adults, but basically small against large trees. So it's also not really clear whether these adults are actually the parents of these individuals. So what we can say is basically that it is pretty likely that there is a lot of error in these adult densities in the predictor, which would then cause overestimation of CNDD. And even more problematic, this is stronger for rare species. And because there are more rare species in the tropics, this can then also create the strong latitudinal gradient. And yeah, actually, at the end, we must basically say that we don't know too much about this latitudinal patterns then. So the conclusion of several independent research groups is thus that the pattern provided by the latitudinal study that exists is not reliable, but also that we actually cannot say anything regarding latitudinal patterns. And the reason for this is, so also the pattern that I present here, so no latitudinal gradient is actually not reliable because what we measure here is not only CNDD, but also an aggregate of many other processes that act at the spatial scale of these quadrats. So that can also be something like dispersal. So what these methods basically allow us to measure how strongly small and large trees are decoupled, but we cannot say anything about the mechanisms that are creating these patterns. So as we can't say anything about these latitudinal patterns so far, actually there's a need to do this in a different setting. And this is something that we are currently working on. So we try to find a more robust and dynamic answer to this question using data from the Forest Geo Network. This is also the similar data that has been used in the first study that investigated latitudinal patterns in CNDD. In the first step, we are fitting species-specific mortality models. You see here one for a species with CNDD and the results of a species without CNDD. So this is kind of similar to previous local studies, but the advantage is that we use the same methodology across all sites. So with the aim to make these individual estimates that we measure there for each species at each site, that these measures of CNDD are comparable. And in the second step, we are then fitting a meta model to assess latitudinal patterns in CNDD while controlling for species abundances. This is necessary because there is some evidence that species with different abundances experience also different levels of CNDD. Typically, it is assumed that rare species have stronger CNDD, although there are also studies that actually show exactly the opposite. Yeah, so this is an ongoing research project and I don't want to go too much into detail here. Yeah, but if you're interested, we expect the results soon, and yeah, so stay tuned to that if that is something that you're interested in. Finally, I would also like to be clear about the limits of these empirical mortality models for assessing the link of CNDD and species diversity. So they do have clear advantages, so these empirical mortality models, but it is actually not exactly what we want to show. When we are interested in stabilization and the effect of CND on species diversity, we would like to measure frequency dependence in population growth rates. And this is not exactly equivalent to mortality because assessing CNDD in one demographic rate during one particular life stage, and yeah, probably we can't even do that for all the species, is only part of the story because CNDD, for example, in an early life stage could be diluted over time, or on the other hand, also by positive density dependence in another vital rate. So basically, there are limitations also to this. So yeah, this is the limitation to these vital rates. The same actually applies also to these transitions. These basically are also limited to early life stages, which makes it a bit tricky to say anything about how meaningful they are for stabilization at the community scale. The idea of these static approaches actually was that the design integrates over several demographic rates in life stages. So in theory, they may be better to approximate fitness, but I would like to emphasize again that they do have statistical and conceptual problems. So namely regression dilution, I have mentioned this, and also the confounding with other processes. And these are really severe problems. So from my point of view, it seems impossible so far to accurately account for these problems, even with null models. Maybe the last thing to say about this CNDD and diversity link, even if we find that CNDD or the strength of CNDD correlates with diversity, with stronger CNDD in more diverse forests, we cannot be sure that this is actually a causal link in the direction of CNDD increases diversity. One could also assume that CNDD just emerges from more diverse forests. So I think there's a bunch of questions that still remain in that field. And definitely more theory, data, and modeling is needed to really make this bigger link. In summary, there are at least two big questions that remain regarding testing the Johnson-Connell hypothesis. And I want to make this point again. We don't know whether CNDD is stronger in the tropics. So there's no evidence for that yet, nothing reliable. And we don't know if CNDD maintains the diversity differences that we see. These are still open questions. Yeah, so this was one example how empirical tree mortality models can be very important for ecological questions and for making ecological inference. Now I would like to take a step back again to where we have started from. So I said when we do this empirical tree mortality models, we basically fit the relationship between tree mortality and other variables, let it be a stand, site, tree characteristics using data. So this is basically how I introduced that. But which options do we have actually? And what are the challenges for fitting these kinds of models? So I would now like to have a closer look at fitting empirical tree mortality models, especially what kind of data we have for doing so, and also which variables are suited to predict tree mortality. The data types for empirical mortality models are actually rather diverse. So I think that's no surprise. Repeated inventory data is a very important one. Advantage of these kind of data sets is that they can inform mortality rates because they are a systematic sample of a population. There are also very large data sets available, for example, national forest inventories, and they also have a good geographical coverage. On the other hand, they are now more and more done on very large forest plots, which is important for fitting such neighborhood environments and models that are presented for CNDD. On the other hand, many of these inventory data sets have only low temporal resolution, especially those done at the national level. These range between 5-10 years, sometimes even longer. And also, we're doing this under natural conditions, so there is a lot of confounding going on. And if we want to test specific hypotheses, this can sometimes, have disadvantages for us. Another data set that is also interesting in terms of mortality is tree ring data. So to make this link between tree mortality and growth, typically a pair of a dead and a living tree is scored with similar attributes. And this has the advantage that we then have long time series before tree death. And we can say something about the growth dynamics and trends before the tree actually died. On the other hand, and this is clearly a limitation, tree ring data cannot provide any information on mortality rates because they are in time and in space not a systematic sample of a population. And they can even provide biased information. So for example, for growth, if we compare growth estimated from tree rings in comparison to that of inventory data, we see that those trees that actually were cored by the field team had a much higher growth in their early life stages. So you can imagine this happens simply because these are the trees that actually made it to the size when they were cored. And like these earlier rings are actually, yeah, these were the lucky ones that we can core later on. Yeah, and finally, also experiments, I have mentioned this already. These have the advantage that we can investigate tree mortality under controlled conditions. So we have less confounding. On the other hand, of course, we are limited to rather small individuals, and it's hard to make claims about yeah, communities because these are rather unnatural conditions. And yeah, maybe shortly thinking back about the CNDD example, what we measure there then with our pods may not reflect well what is happening really in a natural forest. Yeah, so how much we know about tree mortality also varies with tree size. Tree size itself is an important driver of mortality. I guess this U shape is something that is very yeah, intuitive for many people who care about tree mortality. So the idea is that seedlings and small trees experience rather high mortality rates. And then there's kind of a low part of mortality, and then mortality may increase for large trees. When we walk along this U shape, this also differs a bit how well we can say something about the mortality for the different life stages. For example, these small trees are often not included in national forest inventories, which means that we don't have individual records. So we can't directly fit tree mortality models because they're basically only regeneration counts. Although in other inventory programs, this is recorded much better. Yeah, it is assumed that a lot of this is actually driven by competition and maybe also species-specific interactions. On the other hand, this process or like this early life stage mortality may be very important for species composition and diversity. So this is actually something that also receives more and more attention at the moment. Sometimes this also refers to regeneration dynamics and so on. Then in the middle of this, basically, we have a lot of information. These trees are covered in most inventories, and there's also not much going on. So this is kind of a maybe not so exciting time for tree mortality. And then we can think about these large trees. And here, these are often missing in our data, not because they were excluded by the inventory itself, but because they're simply not existent in managed forests. This actually yeah, emphasizes again how important it is to study tree mortality in unmanaged forests. In addition, these large trees may be very important for in response to drought. So there is some evidence that these are actually the trees that are affected most by drought, and they also contribute a lot to the biomass. So this is also something important. When we want to fit tree mortality models, we actually need a lot of data. So there are three reasons for this. There is little signal in binary data. You can imagine it. We basically have only dead and alive. There's nothing, no variation in between. And on top, mortality is, at least when we not look at seedlings, quite a rare event. So we need a lot of trees to find a dead one, luckily. And on top of this, there's also a lot of hidden heterogeneity. So this can happen, for example, because of temporal lags. A tree not necessarily dies exactly after drought. And also, of course, tree mortality is the response of multiple and as well interacting mechanisms. So it's really hard to disentangle this in data as well. There are also remaining issues. One is maybe how different data protocols, providers, and formats go together. So for people who use this kind of different data sets, it always requires quite some effort in terms of homogenization and so on, although there's more and more efforts in improving this. Yeah, low temporal resolution, I've mentioned this already for inventory data sets. And yeah, ideally, of course, we would like to know about the cause of death. It's probably tricky to provide that with data, but I think collecting more information on the circumstances at which trees die together with annual inventories may help in the future, and there are activities on that. So overall, I would nevertheless conclude that the data availability is actually increasing, and this is because more and more repetitions are available. Also, there are more homogenization efforts, and there are such networks as the International Tree Mortality Network, who really provide this collaborative initiatives and the platform to come up also with new data products. And what can we then do with all this new data? We can study mortality patterns at large scales and related to climate. So we have better resources to find actually trends and understand the underlying mechanisms. But also these data sets inspired ecosystem modelers to make their mortality projections more empirical. So you see somehow my shifting towards the modeling now. So yeah, the motivation for focusing on tree mortality and not on other vital rates to including more data is basically that mortality is a very critical vital rate for tree populations. So this can be shown with population models. Here's a matrix population model using elasticity, and we see survival is indeed one of the most important vital rates. The same is actually also evident from dynamic vegetation models. You see here in blue the original mortality function, and when this is replaced with an equally possible formulation in red, entirely different trajectories of basal area can occur. So projections of forest dynamics are highly sensitive to the mortality functions. And making mortality predictions more empirical could thus reduce the uncertainties of projections of forest dynamics. Such models have different applications. So we can project trajectories of forest structure in terms of anticipation of future forests. It is also possible to project future range shifts. And then communicate and make management decisions based on these. Such models can also be used to understand what is driving population dynamics. So this is an example where we basically wanted to see how a distribution of a species is actually restricted, whether by climate or competition. One class of forest models, and this is what you will see on the next few slides, are forest gap models. So these work on patches and then account for different climate and water conditions, and they also include management scenarios. So basically, this allows them to model the forest dynamics on these patches. This is actually this is the Falkland model that we used to try out different empirical mortality models. So when we now want to integrate empirical models, we have to think what kind of predictors should we use in these models. And tree growth is actually a very interesting candidate here. So slower growth before tree death is valuable because yeah, this is something that we have seen from tree ring data sets. And on the other hand, it also turned out to be structurally more reasonable. So you see here that the models that are marked in green actually produce more reasonable responses with less mortality under warmer but moisture conditions and higher mortality when it is drier. So that makes also more sense. So growth seems to be a good predictor. And this is what we did then in the next step. So we fitted empirical mortality models to be used in dynamic vegetation models based on growth and size using data from unmanaged forests in Switzerland and Germany. This is how that looks like. So you don't have to look at the details. The main point here is that small trees that grow slowly have a higher mortality rate. And there are some differences between the species. And these are the models that we then implemented into Forklim and under short and long-term runs. Under short-term dynamics, actually this didn't look too bad. So you see on the right-hand side the empirical Forklim version and the short-term dynamics compared to the observed data on the left in each of these groups looks quite okay. This is not the case if we look at the long-term projections. So there we see that basal area is highly overestimated, and also the species composition of these potential natural vegetation doesn't match. So what we had to do is we had to revise our approach. And because mortality is so much reliant on tree growth, we actually expected that we have to look at these different feedbacks. And we may also think about how can we basically constrain these responses better. So what we did in the next step, we decided not to fit the vital rates directly via individual tree data, but we constrained the vital rate parameters in Forklim using aggregated stand levels. So what we took is we took the basal area to constrain the growth part mainly, and stem number, which we thought would constrain the mortality. And using a Bayesian approach, we then obtained posterior distributions for 8 parameters on growth and mortality. And this we used to do projections in the next step. And here, this looked actually clearly better. So what we obtained here is the inverse model is on the right-hand side, and this much better reflected the potential natural vegetation. We also calibrated more systematically, or we also compared this more systematically with inventory data. And again, also this inverse model fitted better, even to independent natural forests. So what can we conclude from this exercise? If we want to make use of forest data to improve mortality projections, we cannot simply replace some part of the model. That can make models even worse. And using data at higher aggregation level can be helpful to constrain models. So yeah, why not choose a data-oriented structure in the first place? Yeah, so what do I mean here, and how does this relate to other modeling approaches? You can imagine it that way. On the one hand, we can imagine highly data-driven approaches such as correlative SDM, so species distribution models, which on the other hand have problems with reflecting dynamic feedbacks. While on the other hand, we have highly dynamic physiological models that can reflect a lot of mechanisms, but we have problems in connecting these to data because yeah, there's a large number of parameters involved. So as a compromise, I basically see demographic models that are dynamic, but can also be more closely connected to different data sources. So I see these data-driven approaches as a useful extension of the modeling portfolio, especially in light of the knowledge gaps in the mechanistic understanding of forest dynamics. Yeah, So one example could be such a demographic range model. Yeah, here we fitted vital rates of the desert pine in the US, and then combined the vital rates that were fitted with National Forest Inventory data to an IPM, and predicted then the population growth rate in space. Actually, what we found is that while in brown, this is low population growth, actually is nicely constrained. So this is the hot, dry edge, while in green, the wet, cold edge of the distribution is not well restrained. So here in this area, population growth rates are high, although the species doesn't exist there. And we think this has two reasons why this doesn't, why actually the growth rates are not well reflecting the species distribution. This can be the cause of disturbances, and we especially see fire there, which is largely missing in the data because of fire suppression. And we also know from other studies that demographic rates may not decline towards the ranges. So we see this is possible, but we need another step here. And this is the inverse approach. So we need to constrain at multiple levels. And this is actually the framework that we are working on in my group. So such a framework could look like this. The idea is really to constrain parameters of the demographic model at different scales. So here on the top left in green, first demographic parameters and their response to the environment can be calibrated directly via suitable data sets, but we can also update these parameters when the demographic rates are combined in the demographic simulator. So we can update with information on biomass, stem number, but also on the species distributions. So at the end, then we come up with posterior distributions of the parameters of the model that we can then use for projections. Yeah, so these are the methods that we are developing actively in my group. And if you think this is interesting for you and you're currently searching for a job, there will be a PhD postdoc position starting in autumn in my new group at the University of Bayreuth, which is a very great place for ecologists and ecosystem researchers. So if you're interested and do you want to chat about this possibility, just contacted me. And yeah, now we are about at the end, just a few summary words. Mortality is an insightful process. I hope I could convince you, but it also can tell us only part of the story. That yeah, we also have to think about how emerging properties such as diversity are affected by other vital rates. Tree growth is a good predictor of tree mortality, and despite all these initiatives, yeah, predicting tree mortality remains a challenge. I think one way to solve all this is to make more use of this increasing data availabilities and stronger connect data and models. And one way could be to use constraints at multiple levels and scales. Yeah, I would like to thank my group here in Regensburg and many other collaborators that contributed to this work that you have seen today. Also many funding agencies and institutes that supported that work. I hope my take on tree mortality and especially tree mortality modeling was inspiring for you, and I'm happy to take questions. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Lisa. That was a fascinating overview of really such a complex topic, and a really exciting perspective looking forward as well for the new work coming out. So we have several questions coming through in the Q&A here, so I'll just launch into some of those straight away. I think because you finished on a prediction note, maybe we can look at that first. So we have questions about climate change from Rüdiger Grote and also Henrik Hartmann. So Henrik asks, given that they use historical data, how can empirical models account for climate change? And Rüdiger has a similar question, or topically similar. How would CNDD respond to climate change of hotter and drier conditions? So for example, cooling by shading might get more important than light restriction by shading. doesn't this demand a more physiologically based mortality model?
Yeah, let me start with the CNDD question. There are investigations of looking at how these, and now we're really talking more about the mechanisms of CNDD, how these mechanisms respond to environmental changes. So of course, it's hard to use historical data there. Yeah, I mean, there are two approaches. One is heating up the soil and looking like really mechanistically what is going on. And another one is using space for time approach. Yeah, so there is some evidence that under drier conditions and under warmer conditions, this may change also host pathogen interactions and may maybe break these interactions. So this could lead to the missing CNDD agent. So this would be one possibility of actually reducing CNDD, which could then basically also cause a species that before experienced very strong CNDD to become more competitive and even suppress other species. But this is highly, yeah, I mean, this is really theoretical. I don't think that there's any empirical evidence on a case where this actually happened. If someone knows it, please correct me. It's definitely interesting. Yeah, I mean, I know about the debate about, I think this is just something that will always come up when we think about how can we project the future. Mechanisms, of course, we would, in a perfect world, we would take the mechanism, then plug it all together, and then we had the world. But in light of all these different difficulties with, I mean, we do not understand everything, then combining the different agents, all these mechanistic models are having a very hard time in getting mortality rates even right. So I think it's really something that has to go hand in hand, where maybe at the end it's kind of a portfolio of models that we need to have, but I think there is an advantage in using empirical relationships, because we do have the data, and if the model actually produces something that is not supported by data, this should be somehow critical, and we should think about this. I mean, I'm also very much into connecting process and like more mechanistic models to data. This is also very exciting, but yeah, so it's kind of balanced efforts that should go into these initiatives.
Yeah, thanks. Well, hopefully in a few years we'll get even some tighter constraints on that coming out of the work we're doing. Okay, so I go on to another question. Nava Ajay Shankar is asking, how does tree mortality predictions differ from temperate to tropics, and how does diversity affect mortality?
I have to admit that I haven't done too much in the tropics yet. So this global analysis of CNDD is actually really my first tropical research activity, which is also kind of exciting. That's a good question. I guess there are feedbacks, especially if we think about these pathogens. I mean, one could also argue, I mean, all these ideas basically that when a species becomes more abundant, it could also turn around the pathogens. I mean, there are interactive effects between the two. There is even the idea that if a species is not common enough, it will not be able to provide the host, the biomass to provide the pathogen at a viable stage. So maybe then the population of the pathogen breaks down. So yeah, okay, but this can also, or can only happen in very diverse forests where we have very rare species. Myself, I haven't done that much on predicting mortality as a function of diversity, I have to say.
It's a pretty challenging topic in the tropics, and we even struggle in the temperate zone with all our great quality or relatively great quality data that we have here. Not that there's not great data from the tropics as well, just maybe not so much. So a question from Martian Schellhas. If you apply mortality probability derived from observed tree growth to your model, you will rely on the accuracy of the model to predict growth in order to predict mortality. Could this be a reason for the deviation in forklim if directly applied, and for the increased performance when using the Bayesian approach?
Yeah, this is definitely also the reason why we thought we have to revisit the growth parameters in forklim as well. I mean, maybe like when you first think about it, you think, oh, maybe this is not a good idea because I'm linking these things. But in these dynamic vegetation models, it turned out to be quite a good and helpful thing, because the growth estimates per tree actually tell us quite a lot about the vitality. And growth predictions seem to be rather reliable in these models. So this is some kind of variability that we generate there that can tell us a lot about the actual vitality state of that tree. So it seems to be rather helpful, actually. So yeah, I mean, it's kind of an internal thing that we generate there, and also there may be reasons why it would be preferred not to connect the growth and the mortality in a model. Maybe in a statistical framework, we have just discussed this. So, and we thought maybe it's not such a good idea, but especially in a model where a lot of efforts go also into getting the growth predictions right, and having all the influences by water, by competition. I think this is kind of, you can consider this like an integrated variable that otherwise would require maybe 5, 6 other variables. Yeah. So it turned out to be quite helpful, actually.
Okay, we could maybe head a bit towards this, back towards the CNDD topic. So have couple of questions here. One is, what's the spatial scale at which relationships between recruits and adult trees are taken? And I guess, what are the implications of that?
Yeah, there are some studies that show that this is something around 10 to 15 meters. We haven't optimized this yet in, now I'm talking about the small trees. So this is something about trees of a dBH of 1 centimeter. So this is the scale that has often been looked at for these trees. When we talk about seedlings, often then it is assumed that this is kind of a seedling plot, and then the interactions between the seedlings are thought to happen on these 2 by 2 meters or something like that. Yeah, there is so far little evidence on how these effects may even have different scales. So it's kind of an interesting question. Maybe this is more narrow on some sites, or more narrow for some species. It becomes hard to compare it then. If we imagine that these interactions happen on a 5 meter scale with a 5 meter radius for one species, or in a much broader for another species, then it's really hard to compare these effects between the species, because then we don't know how much this will actually play out for stabilization. So that's kind of tricky. But of course, at the end, this depends on the mechanisms that are going on. If it is something that is very mobile, then it can also extend up to 30 meters. Why not? Insects can easily make that and can be attracted by species over larger distances. If this is a pathogen in the soil, which is actually one of the often considered mechanisms, it's probably more local.
So you kind of outlined, so it's actually a question from me now, I'm taking chairs, but you outlined in your talk a lot of the challenges of trying to test the CNDD hypothesis. Do you actually see a perspective that we can ever truly test this, or are we always going to be wondering a little bit?
I think there are two ways we have to go. One is to go to the small scale, or like actually maybe we have to take three ways. One is, first of all, we have to make sure that there are patterns in the demographic rates. If there's nothing at all, it becomes more and more unlikely that there is kind of a latitudinal pattern in CNDD. It may still be important in some forests, and I think there is still a need to look at the mechanisms, and this is maybe the other research field that I see that should be taken to really understand what is. I mean, for some species we know this. So, for example, I think the best example I know is Prunus serotina. So, a species that has a pathogen in the US that is basically limiting it, and it cannot be dominant because it is having this aggressive pathogen. And in Europe, it's the same pathogen, but it is not aggressive. And therefore here, the species can take over in the understory. And I think like having more of these examples is actually nice, because then we can basically stretch out really from the mechanism up to the pattern that we see. Yeah. I mean, ideally, we would basically kill the pathogen at a large scale and see how the species develops. Of course, we will not do that in natural forests. So, I mean, that would be one pathway to take. And yeah, I don't see this happening. So at the end, if we really want to make this link for many species, probably it requires more theoretical. We have written this review that we say that maybe some kind of rules of thumb could help, like theoretical considerations that tell us, okay, if you measure this, and this is like really 10 times larger than some other quantitative measure, maybe with this we can find an approach how to measure something in the field that is then meaningful for the pattern we care about. But it is not so easy. We're doing this for 50 years, so it's kind of a tricky question. On the other hand, it's also a very an exciting one, which really has all these implications from a very small up to a very large scale. I think this is also what people really fascinates about this question.
I wonder how long it'll be before we as a species manage to kill one of those species by accident and make the perfect
oh yeah, maybe. Yeah, I mean, all what we do with our globally connected world is basically such an experiment, isn't it?
Yeah, we've got lots of little experiments everywhere, haven't we?
Yeah.
So we're really fast running out of time here, but I just wanted to take one more question. There's been a few coming up in this general topic, but this one I read out from Jane Foster. She says she works a lot in the eastern US forests. The highest rates of tree mortality that I observe right now are the results of introduced pests killing common canopy tree species. These include emerald ash borer, hemlock woody, aldehyde, and others. How do insects and diseases factor into your mortality models?
I have to say that we are not having a lot of these in Europe, one thing, and we also didn't include such forests. So the natural forests that the data that we took basically comes from forest sites without many disturbances. I think we even excluded wind and fire, if I think so, where large events were recorded, because we were interested in, I know this is not a really precise term, background or stress-induced mortality. So, I mean, we know that this is very gradual, but I think from all what I did on tree mortality, we are not even good in that. So it's definitely worth to have done this and to think about how we can basically get the classical forest dynamics right in a way. Yeah, but I mean, I do agree. So thanks for that question. I mean, I do agree that these disturbances are, on the other hand, having massive impacts on the forest, and this of course may increase in future. So it is an important thing. Maybe then it becomes a bit easier to model this, because we don't care so much whether it is I don't know, 0.9% or 1% of tree mortality, but 60 or 70, or we can just imagine the tree species will not be there for some time. So it is a bit different. I think the perspective also differs a lot, because like it's a very fine tuning what happens there at these low mortality rates.
Fantastic, thank you. Well, I'm sorry to everybody else who had a question that you didn't get around to answering it. There's really quite a long list back here, but thank you to everybody asking questions, and thank you, Lisa, for all these really interesting insights and thoughtful discussion. I'm going to hand over to Rupert just to finish off.
Yeah,
yes.
Thanks also.
Well, thanks also from my side. I mean, Lisa, this was wonderful. It was really, really great to see your insights, and also a very different perspective on mortality than what we've had in the seminars previously. Thanks also to everybody who attended, and the questions were really thoughtful and a really, really good discussion. This to me really shows how great it is to have this platform and this network of talking about these different aspects of mortality. I want to just conclude this session by pointing out a few things. For one, the seminar and also Lisa's talk will be available on our YouTube channel, where you can also find all the other seminar talks that we've had. So you can forward the links, you can watch some of the seminars that you've missed. It's all on our YouTube channel. Also, be on the lookout for further seminars. So we are planning to continue this seminar series roughly at a schedule of one seminar every 4 to 8 weeks. And we will be announcing this via our website, but also via our Twitter feed, which is also listed here. And what we also do via Twitter is we are highlighting tree mortality papers. So you can use the hashtag tree mortality paper to tag papers that you find interesting and relevant in the context of tree mortality, and we're trying to get a good collection together of those, and in that way also contribute a little bit to the community of trying to better understand and compile what's going on in terms of global tree mortality processes. Well, that's it for me. Thanks again, everybody, particularly Lisa, for this great input today. And looking forward to see you all next time.